A bloodied soldier stumbles into a Nevada diner at 2 a.m. The stray German shepherd no one could touch? He just lunged, not to attack, but to catch his collapsing handler. Now a battle-scarred waitress must protect them, both from the killers still hunting them. Because this isn't just a dog. It's a war veteran who never stopped serving. And tonight, the graveyard shift is fighting back. The neon sign above Murphy's diner buzzed like a dying insect, flickering in the Nevada night. It cast a sickly pink glow over the cracked parking lot, where oil stains shimmered, like dark galaxies under the streetlights. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee, stale grease, and the faint metallic tang of the ancient jukebox in the corner, still playing Patsy Cline on a loop, even though no one had fed it quarters in years. Jess wiped down the counter with a rag that had seen better days. Her hands moved automatically, fingers tracing the same grooves. In the Formica she'd polished 1,000 times before. She was a woman built for silence. Lean, sharp angles. Dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail. The kind of person who didn't startle easy. The regulars knew better than to ask about the scars on her forearms, the way her gaze sometimes locked onto the middle distance like she was watching a reel of old nightmares. Then there was the dog. He showed up like clockwork at 1:17 a.m., slipping out of the shadows beyond the dumpster like a ghost. A German shepherd, big and broad-shouldered, with a coat that had once been pristine but now bore the marks of hard living, scars. Along his muzzle, a notch in one ear, fur matted in places where he couldn't reach to lick clean. He never begged, never barked, just sat there, amber eyes reflecting the diner's neon like twin warning lights. The first time Jess saw him, she'd tossed a handful of fries out the back door. The dog didn't move, just watched her with that unnerving, calculating stare. "Suit yourself," she muttered. But the next night, she left a bowl of water beside the dumpster. The night after that, a chunk of meatloaf wrapped in wax paper. Still, the dog kept his distance. It was Hank, the graveyard shift cook, who finally said what everyone was thinking. "That ain't no stray," he grunted, flipping a burger with more force than necessary. "Look at the way he sits. Like he's on duty." Jess glanced out the window. The dog was sitting back, straight, head high, ears pricked forward. Not the slouch of a scavenger. The posture of something trained to pay attention. She thought of the K-9 units she'd seen overseas. The way the dogs moved like extensions of their handlers, all coiled tension and silent communication. "Yeah," she said softly. "He's waiting for someone." Hank snorted. Or something. Then, one rainy Tuesday, everything changed. Jess was refilling the sugar dispensers when the bell above the door jangled. A man walked in, late 30s. Maybe, with the kind of face that had seen too much sun and not enough sleep. He hesitated just inside the doorway, eyes scanning the room like he was checking exits. And the dog, who never came inside, never even approached the door, suddenly stood. His entire body went rigid. A low, shuddering whine escaped his throat, so quiet Jess almost missed it. The man's head snapped toward the sound. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then the dog took a single step forward, and the man whispered a name. Jess didn't catch it, but she saw the way his hands trembled. Saw the dog's tail give one stiff, hesitant wag, like he wasn't sure he was allowed. And in that moment, she knew, this wasn't just a story about a stray. It was a story about a soldier who'd lost his war, and the dog who never stopped looking for him. The rain came down in sheets that night, hammering against the diner's windows like it was trying to break in. Jess had just poured a refill for Old Man Ritchie, his fourth cup, black as his mood, when the bell above the door chimed. Not the cheerful ding of a regular. A broken, stuttering sound, like the spring was giving out. Jess looked up. The man in the doorway swayed on his feet, one hand braced against the frame, the other pressed hard into his side. His leather jacket was soaked through, but the dark stain spreading beneath his fingers wasn't rainwater. Blood. A lot of it. Richie froze mid-sip. The two truckers at the corner. Booth fell silent, cards forgotten. Even Hank stopped, scraping the grill, the spatula hovering over the patties like he wasn't sure whether to flip them or arm himself. Then the smell hit, copper and sweat and something sour underneath. Fear. Jess was moving before her brain caught up, that old muscle memory kicking in. Tourniquet. Pressure. Keep him talking. But she'd only taken 2 steps when a shadow blurred past her legs. The dog. Inside. He must have slipped in when the door opened, silent as smoke. Now he stood between Jess and the stranger, his body rigid, ears flat against his skull. A growl rumbled deep in his chest, not the mindless snarl of an aggressive animal, but something sharper. A warning. A question. The man's breath hitched. His blood-slick hand twitched toward the dog. "Easy," Jess said to both of them. The dog didn't listen. He took a step forward, nose working the air, then let out a sound that punched straight through Jess's ribs. A whine, high and broken. The kind of noise you'd hear from a wounded thing. The man's knees buckled. Jess lunged, but the dog got there first, shoving his shoulder under the man's arm like he'd done it 100 times before. They hit the floor together, the man's back slamming against the linoleum, the dog's paws braced on either side of his chest. "Jesus Christ," Hank muttered. Jess dropped beside them, her fingers already probing the wound. The bullet, had to be a bullet, had torn through the meat of his side, just below the ribs. Not a clean in and out. Something jagged had ripped its way through, leaving edges that wept crimson. "Who did this to you?" Jess demanded, wadding up her apron and pressing it hard against the wound. The man's lips moved, but all that came out was a wet cough. His pupils were blown wide, the irises nearly swallowed by black. Shock setting in. One of the truckers fumbled for his phone. "I'll call an ambulance." "No cops," the man gasped. His hand found the dog's neck, fingers twisting in the matted fur. "Please." The dog whined again, licking at the man's wrist, not frantic, but deliberate, like he was checking for something. Jess's gaze dropped to the man's belt. No holster, no wallet, just a loop of worn leather where something had been clipped. A leash? A name tag? Outside, a car engine growled to life, tires screeching against wet pavement. The dog's head snapped up, his body going taut as a bowstring. Jess didn't need to ask. Someone had tried to finish the job, and the dog knew who. The ambulance took 11 minutes to arrive. 11 minutes of Jess's knees going numb against the diner floor, her palms slick with blood that wasn't hers. 11 minutes of the dog, Rex, she knew his name now, panting hot, anxious breaths against the man's cheek, refusing to budge. Even when the EMTs shouldered in with their bags and their crackling radios. One of them, a kid barely old enough to shave, reached for the man's shoulder. Rex's lip peeled back, revealing teeth that gleamed like bone under the fluorescence. "Don't." Jess caught the EMT's wrist. "Let me." She leaned over the man. Sergeant Daniel Reyes, according to the dog tags tangled in his shirt, and spoke low, near his ear. "They're here to help. But he needs to know it's okay." Reyes's eyelids fluttered. His fingers twitched against Rex's collar. Jess touched the dog's head. "Stand down." A beat. Then Rex exhaled sharply through his nose and backed up, just enough to let the EMTs work, but not enough to lose contact. His flank stayed pressed to Reyes's leg, vibrating with tension. The kid EMT whistled as he cut away Reyes's jacket. GSW. Oblique trajectory. Looks like it nicked the liver. He glanced at Jess. You military? Once. She didn't elaborate. They loaded Reyes onto the gurney. Rex shadowed every movement. His tail stiff, his gaze locked on his handler's face. When they wheeled him toward the doors, the dog tried to follow. Whoa, buddy. The older EMT blocked him with a knee. No dogs in the rig. Rex's ears flattened. A growl built in his chest, not angry, pleading. Jess grabbed his collar. I've got him. The EMT hesitated. That a working dog? She looked down at the tattoo inside Rex's ear, the tiny, faded numbers that marked him as government property. At the way his claws clicked against the tile, pacing an invisible perimeter around the blood-stained Reyes had left behind. Yeah, she said quietly. He is. The cops arrived as the ambulance pulled away. 2 uniforms. Bored and blinking sleep out of their eyes. They took statements, snapped photos of the blood smeared across the diner floor, asked questions no one could answer. Any idea who'd want to shoot him? The taller cop nodded. At the empty booth where Reyes had been. Jess wiped her hands on a clean rag. He didn't exactly stop for small talk. Behind her, Rex whined. He was sitting at the diner's door, his nose pressed to the glass, watching the taillights disappear into the rain. The cop followed her gaze. That his dog. Jess thought of the way Reyes's fingers had knotted in Rex's fur. The way the dog had known to brace his fall. The way neither of them had needed words. Yeah, she said. He's his. The cop scribbled something in his notepad. We'll need to check for chips or tags. Already did. Jess held up the dog tags she'd palmed. When they loaded Reyes up, the metal was still warm from his skin. Sergeant Daniel Reyes, 10th Mountain Division. Blood type O positive. The shorter cop frowned. And the dog. Jess glanced at Rex. At the notch in his ear, the scars. Along his muzzle. At the way he was still trembling. Just slightly like a live wire. His name's Rex, she said. And that was all she gave them. The diner emptied out after that. The truckers went back to their routes. Hank scraped the congealed burgers off the grill with more force than necessary. Jess stayed by the door, watching the rain and the dog watching the road. After a while, Rex sighed and lay down, his chin on his paws. But his eyes never left the horizon. Jess crouched beside him. He's coming back, she said, though she had no way of knowing. Rex's tail thumped once. Like he believed her. Or like he knew better. She reached out, hesitated, then scratched behind his ears. His fur was damp and gritty with dirt, but beneath that was another scent, gunpowder and leather and the sharp, clean smell of snow. Mountains wore home. Jess exhaled slowly. Guess we're both waiting now, huh? Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Somewhere beyond the neon glow of the diner, a siren wailed. And the dog kept watch. The days after Sergeant Reyes disappeared into the ambulance bled together like watercolors left in the rain. Jess kept Rex behind the diner counter, where the regulars could toss him scraps without making a fuss. The dog accepted their offerings with quiet dignity, but his eyes never stopped tracking the door. Every time the bell chimed, his ears pricked forward, then flattened when it wasn't him. Hank started calling him Sarge. Old Man Richie brought in a chew toy shaped like a grenade. And Jess? She kept Reyes' dog tags tucked in her apron pocket, the metal warming to her body heat until she could barely feel the edges anymore. Then, one slow Tuesday morning, the newspaper landed on the counter with a slap. Jess didn't realize her hands were shaking until Rex nudged her knee. The article was 3 paragraphs of nothing, no names, no motive, just the cold facts of a burglary gone wrong. But the address jumped out at her. A clinic 2 miles east, right along Reyes' last known route. She looked down at Rex. His nostrils flared like he could smell the ink, the truth, the danger in those words. "Guess we're making a detour," she muttered. The vet's office was a squat brick building with barred windows and a flickering, open sign. The parking lot was empty except for a single cruiser, its engine ticking like a countdown. Jess parked around back, out of sight. Rex stood stiff in the passenger seat, his hackles raised. "You smell him?" she asked. The dog whined low in his throat. Inside, the waiting room reeked of antiseptic and fear. A young cop leaned against the reception desk, flipping through a chart. He glanced up when Jess entered, then did a double-take at Rex. "Ma'am, you can't bring a dog in here." "Sergeant Reyes," Jess interrupted. "Where is he?" The cop's jaw tightened. "I'm afraid I can't." A door down the hall creaked open. A vet tech in scrubs stepped out, her face drawn. "Lieutenant?" "He's asking for the dog." The cop exhaled through his nose. "Christ." Jess didn't wait for permission. She followed the tech down the hall, Rex's claws clicking urgently on the linoleum. The room at the end was dark, the blinds drawn. Reyes lay, propped up on the bed, his torso wrapped in enough gauze to mummify a saint. His face was pale under the stubble, but his eyes lit up when Rex bounded to his side. "Hey, partner," he rasped. The dog didn't jump, didn't bark, just pressed his forehead to Reyes's chest, his whole body trembling with the effort of staying gentle. Jess hovered in the doorway, suddenly feeling like an intruder. Reyes noticed her. "You're the diner girl, Jess." He nodded toward Rex. "He give you any trouble?" "Only when I tried to throw out day-old bacon." That got a weak chuckle out of him. Then he winced, his hand flying to his bandages. The cop from the lobby shouldered past Jess. "Reyes, we need to talk about what happened." "Later." Reyes's fingers buried themselves in Rex's fur. "I'm off duty." The cop opened his mouth, then snapped it shut when Rex turned to stare at him. The message was clear. "Try me." Jess smirked. "Guess some bonds don't break easy." Reyes met her gaze over the dog's head. "No," he said quietly. "They don't." Back at the diner that night, Jess poured 2 cups of coffee, one for her, one for Hank, and watched Rex snooze under their usual booth. His paws twitched like he was chasing something in his dreams. Maybe he was. Hank slid into the seat across from her. "So, that sergeant gonna stick around?" Jess sipped her coffee. "Dunno." Outside, a semi rumbled past, its headlights cutting through the dark. Somewhere out there, Reyes was healing. Somewhere out there, the man who'd shot him was still running. And in a diner off Route 95, a waitress and a war dog kept watch over the graveyard shift. Jess reached down to scratch Rex's ear. The dog sighed in his sleep. Some stories didn't need endings. Just time.